Welcome to the Bible and Science. This is Dave Prentice. I'm a retired public high school teacher, certified in all branches of science and math. I've also taught on the Bible and Science for many years, both in the U.S. and on many overseas mission trips. This is episode 50 of the Bible and Science. We've been talking for a while about the diversity of mammals. Last episode was primarily on whales, which will also be the main focus today, but then hopefully we'll get to things like bats and rodents and perhaps even horses. So let's go back to the question of where whales came from. Supposedly, there was some four-legged creatures that lived on land, and they began to wander into the water more and more and more, and eventually became semi-aquatic and fully aquatic. Well, okay, there are some four-legged creatures today that still spend a lot of time in the water. That doesn't mean that they're going to be evolving from legs into flippers. If you go back to the last episode, number 49, you'll see some of the problems with the idea of the four-legged animals evolving into whales and the other cetaceans like dolphins and porpoises. There's no fossil evidence of transitions. There are several fossils that have four legs that seem to be aquatic animals, but that doesn't mean they evolved. So we're going to get into why that is not likely to happen. Okay, here's a question for you. Why would anything evolve into anything else? I've gone into this before and I will again. But the reason that you have two arms, two legs, nose, mouth, and so forth is because the structures in your body, like any living thing, are present because your DNA contains the instructions on how to put them there. So if some sort of fish evolved into amphibians and reptiles and then mammals, and the mammals diverged into dozens of different types, there would have to be thousands upon thousands, or perhaps even millions of mutations, and many of them would have to be beneficial. They would help the animals. Each step would have to build on all of the mutations from the lower types. In fact, in the case of whales, there should be a whole bunch of almost whales. Oh, it's not quite Ambulocetus, it's not quite Basilosaurus, it's almost there, it's almost there. There should be a whole lot more of the almost forms than the final or terminal forms. And all of this is going to happen in spite of the error correcting mechanisms being built into DNA. That was covered in an earlier lesson. DNA has got multiple error correcting mechanisms built into it. So if you get a chance, go back and look up those. So the claim that was brought out that I mentioned last time was that whales evolved from something like a hippo. Maybe not a hippopotamus as living in the world today, but a sister taxon of hippopotami. So evolutionists, of course, reject the idea that whales appeared in an initially complex form, that is creation. And so they have to figure, okay, they came from initial disorganization and became more and more organized and gained more and more of the beneficial features that they have. So some evolutionists have proposed that, okay, the whales must have evolved from some even-toed, hoofed animal. What? An artiodactyl, similar to cattle. Perhaps some sort of a sister taxon of hippos. And then over many, many, many generations, millions of years, supposedly the ancestors spent more and more and more time in the water until they lost all their land features and became completely aquatic. So what's the argument for that? Well, whales had to come from somewhere. What could they have come from? Whale DNA, whales are obviously mammals when you study the internal structure. They had to come from some other mammal. So whale DNA is closer to hippos than to any other land animal. Okay, well, how close is the DNA of whales to hippos, really? I'm not talking about the external structures like the flippers and so forth. I want to talk about the DNA. In order to do valid comparisons of any two types, we need to compare the complete genome, the DNA, all the way from the first base pair to the last base pair, and see how similar is it. Well, how many different types of creatures have had their DNA completely sequenced? Humans, maybe a couple of other ones, not very many. But there are only a few types of animals that have had their complete genome sequenced. So if whales are similar to hippos, well, what does the whale DNA look like? What does the hippo DNA look like? The National Library of Medicine database, there's the link up there, it doesn't list hippo DNA as completely sequenced. It estimates the contents at about 2.4 billion base pairs. And last time I mentioned that if we took the total number of letters and spaces in Tolstoy's War and Peace, that's about 3 million. This is about 800 times as many base pairs as there are letters in War and Peace. Well, okay. The National Library of Medicine database estimates the contents of hippo DNA at about 2.4 billion base pairs. Billion. Okay. How many types of whales have had their DNA completely sequenced? The database does not show a single one as being completely sequenced. So the blue whale, the largest animal known, is estimated to have about 2.7 billion base pairs. Okay, that's 300 million more than hippos. That's 100 times the information contained in War and Peace, just for the difference from 2.4 billion of the hippo to about 2.7 billion of the blue whale. Okay, the minke whale, this is one of the ones that dives really, really, really deep. It has about 2.5 billion base pairs, which is 100 million more than hippos. And the killer whale, the orca, has about 2.2 billion. This is going to indicate that from some ancestor like a hippo, there would have been not a gain but a loss of about 300 million base pairs, 100 times the amount of information that there is in War and Peace, lost. And then the pygmy right whale has about 2.5 billion base pairs. That's 100 million more base pairs than hippos do. And then perhaps you're familiar with chromosomes. Humans have 46 chromosomes. You get 23 from mom, 23 from dad, unless something goes wrong. Okay, whales have 21 or 22 pairs. Okay, think about some animals that can breed but might not have the same number of base pairs. For instance, horses and donkeys. They have different chromosome counts. Every now and then, well, pretty frequently, they can breed and produce offspring, but how often are those offspring fertile and able to have babies themselves? It just doesn't happen. Animals with different chromosome counts have never been known to produce fertile offspring. So if we're going from some hippo-like ancestor toward whales, if we can somehow get two of them that have different chromosome counts to have babies, the babies are infertile. Okay, what happens to evolution then? It stops. Did whales evolve from hippos? Well, think about the tooth arrangement. In hippos, generally, they have 36 teeth, of which 4 are tusks, large tusk-like teeth. How many teeth do baleen whales have? None. They have baleen, the arrangement of curtains made out of keratin. And then within the toothed whales, the other major division, some species have just a few teeth. Others have up to 200 teeth. And then some of those with teeth have only bottom teeth and a groove in the upper jaw where the lower teeth fit. Well, okay, how many whales have a tooth arrangement that are even remotely like that of hippos? A grand total of 0. And you'll pretty frequently hear that whales have vestigial legs. Yeah, at the back of their bodies, by the reproductive organs, they have these bony structures, which some call vestigial legs. They're not vestiges from earlier stages of evolution at all. They have a very important function. You know, whales are big and they're trying to breed out there in the ocean, and it's going to be hard to line yourself up with your partner, but the whales use the so-called vestigial legs to help maintain the position during mating. If there were none of these so-called vestigial legs, there would be no more whales because they wouldn't be able to breed at all. Well, where did whales come from and have they changed in the fossil record? There's a place in South America called the Atacama Desert. It's on the west coast of South America by Peru, Argentina, around that area. The Atacama is one of the driest places on Earth. It averages about 6/10 of an inch of rain every year. There are dozens of whale fossils there, well mineralized whale fossils, indicating, oh, yeah, they were buried under sediment in order to be able to acquire those minerals. So there are dozens of well mineralized whale fossils. There's a picture in the middle of what's called an Ica whale skeleton, and then there are also baleen whale skeletons found at the same general area. There are dozens of well-preserved fossil skeletons found about 130 feet above sea level. Wait, whales swim in the water. That would indicate what us creationists believe, that there was a change of elevation of the land later. So after the animals were buried under a significant amount of water that had a significant amount of sediment so they could be mineralized, then sometime later, that area pushed up to about 130 feet above sea level. It's also 6/10 of a mile away from the Pacific Ocean. So these whales at the Atacama, at Cerro Balena, Whale Valley, they're buried in many meters of sediment. And here's an interesting thing. They're all facing the same direction. Something made all of these whales point the same direction. I don't know what it was, but I could speculate that maybe there was a tsunami that came along and pushed them all into the same inlet and they were trapped there. Even if it wasn't a tsunami, I would say it's a pretty good indication that they were buried in a flood, some sort of flood conditions. I've never been down there myself, but that would be an interesting place to go. Left coast, the west coast of Chile and Peru, down there in South America. So this is in South America. But meanwhile, let's go across the Atlantic Ocean to the Sahara Desert. There are hundreds of fossil whales at a place called Wadi al-Hitan. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Forgive me if I'm not. But there are hundreds of fossil marine vertebrates, including a great many whales. The western desert at Fayoum of Egypt, which is hundreds of feet above sea level and also miles from any large body of water, it contains a great many buried and mineralized whale fossils and other fossil vertebrates. So these guys were in the water, and somehow or other they were thrown hundreds of feet above sea level, and they were also swept miles away from any large body of water. Sahara Desert, it really is not known for being very wet. Somehow, though, these things were buried under conditions that allowed them to be inundated in sediment. They were preserved in sediment, and they were miles away from any large body of water. So I would ask you, if you've got your mind made up, I don't know why you're bothering to watch this thing, but I would say, unless your mind is already made up, consider the possibility that these animals could have been buried by a great flood. Several places, there are whales, fossilized whales, buried in desert environments, significantly above sea level and inland from the coast. I think that that would indicate that sometime there might have been a great flood. Yeah, I can name that for you. Read your Bible, Noah's flood. So let's go back over some of the features of whales. Compared to any land animal, including its alleged relative, the hippopotamus, which has a great deal of difference in its DNA, hundreds of millions of base pairs, the whale has, instead of hoofed feet, it has fins. Well, hippos, they have hooves on their feet. Then also the feet of all of the whales have been replaced, supposedly, but they have feet instead of flippers, and they have blubber. Sometimes I feel like I have a lot of blubber, but that's what I go on a diet for. But they have blubber that serves to insulate the body. Some of the whales spend a lot of time around Antarctica where the water is freezing, and they're okay because their blubber is an insulating feature. Their eye is greatly modified as compared to land animals, so their eye allows them to see in water. And also, swimmers in the Olympics, they try to be as streamlined as possible. Well, okay, whales and other cetaceans have special skin to streamline movement through the water. And then, I've mentioned this before, baleen. There is no animal in the world that has anything considered a precursor to baleen. It's the same type of material, keratin, that's found in fingernails and other relatively soft structures in hair. Baleen is made of the same basic kind of thing. So some types of whales have baleen. Those that have teeth have varying tooth arrangements, great deal of variation within the toothed whales. And then, okay, you may have heard about how dogs hear so well. Whales hear far better than dogs, even far better than bats. They have a hearing apparatus superior to anything else known in the animal kingdom. They can even hear things that are well over 100,000 hertz. So when they're communicating with each other, when they're going, ooh, they're saying, here I am, or some of them are using that to locate food. The ones that go click, 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 like flipper. I hope that didn't disturb you too much for me to try to make a dolphin sound. But they have got a mechanism to make sound that's particularly appropriate to their environment. And then, since they're mammals, they have to nurse their young. They have a way to nurse the young underwater without drowning them, also to give birth underwater without drowning them. Then whale brains allow partial sleep because they're going to be in the water and they have to keep breathing every so often. But if they go sound asleep, the water's going to come in and drown them. Whale brains allow partial sleep for the purposes of rest, but also allow enough awareness so the whale does not drown while sleeping. You've heard of sleepwalking. Well, they're sleep floating. They come up and get some more air. Some types of whales, the toothed whales, have a single blowhole. The other types, the baleen whales, have two blowholes. So then inside the blowhole or blowholes, there's going to be at least one protective flap in the case of the ones that have a single hole, or two flaps to prevent water from rushing in. And then whales have the amazing ability to make sound underwater. They don't open up to the outside and blow out bubbles of air to make sound. They make sounds inside, and the sounds just go all over the place. Some of them in the baleen whales are known to travel as far as thousands of miles, and the whales interpret these. We're trying to figure out what they're doing. Whales seem to have a language where they're saying, here I am, and perhaps saying something about whether they're happy or not. I don't know. I wish I spoke whale. But the whales can make sounds underwater without losing air. Though the baleen whales use those apparently to communicate and to find their position and so forth. But then the toothed whales use echolocation. They make the sounds that you heard Flipper say on TV. It was even on an episode of The Simpsons where it turns out the whales are saying, "You're going to die." But the whales that make the chirps do echolocation, so they send out a beam of sound in one direction only toward what they think is going to be their food, and it bounces off of those and it just comes back in the correct direction. It doesn't go everywhere. And then the narwhals have horns. What? How do they get horns? No other whales have a horn. And some whales have the ability to hold their breath for over 3 hours. Wow. I do well to hold my breath for 1 minute. I think humans, the most anybody could do is like 8 or 10 minutes, but whales, 3 hours. And then some of the whales are able to dive thousands of feet deep. The pressure is so intense that it would crush our best submarines, the nuclear submarines. We have to have something, the bathyspheres that go down to the bottom of the ocean have reinforced steel coatings so that they can withstand the pressure. Well, these whales, they just dive down there and they come right back up and they don't get the bends. So all of things are due to what? Random mutations in DNA? I don't think so. I think they point toward design instead. So let's think about a principle that scientists routinely appeal to. It's called Occam's razor, named after William of Occam, and it could be paraphrased as the simplest answer that fits all the facts is probably the best. Or you might have heard, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. If your answer fits the facts, it's probably the best. Well, there are at least two proposed answers for the origin of whales and all of their features. Number one, creation. Whales appeared in a condition not too far removed from the way they are at present. So that certainly could not have happened by natural processes only. It would have required intervention by some intelligent outside nature. Or if you absolutely have got it made up in your mind, there could not be anything outside nature, could not be any intelligence, then you have no choice. You have to believe in evolution. Some ancient land animal must have spent more and more time in the water, some animal that had legs and could hold its breath and swim under the water. And then over millions and millions of years, at least thousands of generations, DNA made copying errors, that is random mutation, that gradually caused the DNA to alter so that it would have these new features. Meanwhile, the in-between types disappeared. We don't have the fossils of them. But DNA copying errors, random mutations, gradually produced all of the unique features of cetaceans. Didn't leave transitions. And at each step, a male and female of each type had to acquire complementary mutations in their reproductive systems. Remember, there are varying numbers of chromosomes, and so the male and the female at the same time and the same place are going to have to acquire not just identical mutations, because male and female are not exactly the same. They're going to have to acquire complementary mutations in their reproductive system. Can you see what happened? Nope. We look at fossils and we interpret them and we try to decide what they mean. Well, yeah, we can't dogmatically say which of those ideas, initial complexity, creation, or initial disorganization, evolution, we can't dogmatically say which is true, if either. But all we can do is decide which seems more reasonable. I would say, according to Occam's razor, the idea of initial complexity makes a whole lot more sense. But then I am open to the possibility there is a supernatural intelligence, a God. If not, you have no choice. You have to believe in evolution. And if you're wrong, the Bible talks about what will happen to those that refuse to believe there is a God. The Bible says those that would come to God must first believe that he exists. Well, if you have staunchly refused to believe God exists, The Bible tells you where you're going to go, and it's not a good place. If you're like me and you've made a step of faith to say, this looks to me like it's reasonable that there's a super intelligence, what if I'm wrong? It wouldn't matter, because at the end of my life, I would never know. This goes back to what's called Pascal's wager. If I say there is a God, and there is a God, I do well. If I say there is a God, and there is not a God, it matters not. If I say there is not a God, and there is not a God, it matters not. If I say there is not a God, and there is a God, God help me. So I think the study of creation, the study of the living world, would point you toward the conclusion that, oh yeah, there's a supernatural intelligence. Now, go get your Bible, start reading it. I can give you all of this technical information, but unless you surrender your life to Jesus Christ, it's not going to do you any good. You'll be an educated fool in hell. Yeah, I do believe in hell. Jesus talked more about it than anybody else. So let's move away from the whales and talk about some of the other mammals. Okay, Lamarckianism has been falsified over and over and over again by experimentation. This is the idea that by building up or not using body structures, the changes can be inherited by the next generation. So Lamarck's example was he thought that perhaps giraffes stretched their necks for many generations, and so they got longer necks, and this was passed on to the descendants. It doesn't work that way. There have been many, many, many experiments done on this, but as I've read professional articles in the paleontology journals and science journals, it's amazing that over and over and over they say, well, these creatures acquired these features because they needed them. No, it doesn't work that way. Even many professional articles, though, implicitly appeal to the false concept, the Lamarckian concept, that evolving organisms develop new features as they needed them. Yeah, but biological experimentation has shown us that the only way to add or remove features would be by adding or removing genes. Now, if the genes are already present, you can accentuate them through breeding. You can get fluffy dogs by breeding dogs and get poodles. You could get hairless dogs by breeding them and get Mexican hairless, but they're still dogs. And they still have the same basic feature, the same ordinal characters. It would take an incredible number of mutations to go from some ancestral animal to even something like whales. There would be many side branches of almost whales. There are not. And there are many other things that you would have the almost form. Lamarckianism has been thoroughly falsified. Organisms do not get new features as needed. They only get what their DNA gives them. So I'm going to go to bat here for a moment, pun, and talk about one of the orders of mammals. Okay, the whales are one of the main groups of marine mammals, swimming mammals. Yeah, there's also one group of flying mammals, order Chiroptera, the bats. There are many types of bats, but the first fossil bats are supposedly over 55 million years old. Living bats are easily recognizable as the same basic type. They haven't evolved. One individual may have a little bit more developed this feature, that feature, maybe thicker legs or something like that, but they have not evolved. They've not gained or lost structure. They haven't gained anything, haven't lost anything old. So bats, Chiroptera, continue to be the only mammals that have wings. And the bat pelvis, because of the way the bat hangs there, it's rotated 180 degrees from other mammals. How is that going to happen? The bat starts rotating its pelvis? No, it's got to be the DNA that has the information to do that. And then the only other animals that use echolocation are toothed whales. They're not considered close relatives of bats at all. So there are some of the types of bats shown down there. There are living bats, there are fossil bats that are essentially the same as the living bats. Well, the next episode, we're going to continue on. We'll talk about lagomorphs, rabbits and hares, and rodents, and then we'll start getting into the idea that perhaps horses evolved from gradual changes, gradual mutations in DNA, and I'm persuaded it didn't happen. And if I'm doing my job properly, then you'll be persuaded it didn't happen either. So check back for the next episode of the Bible and Science.